So my name is Joseph Nagy, and I am the Shattuck Professor of Irish Studies here in the Department of Celtic Languages and Literatures at Harvard. This is the only Department of Celtic Languages and Literatures in the Americas, and we're very proud of that. It's a small department, but it does have a hardy group of graduate students who are working toward their PhDs in Celtic languages and literatures. We also offer undergraduate courses, and our numbers are good, and there's a lot of interest in matters Celtic, which includes Irish and Welsh and Scottish Gaelic and Breton and various other Celtic languages, past and present. And this is what we all do here in the Celtic department. So as we approach or are actually on St. Patrick's Day, the figure of St. Patrick is one that a great deal has been written about, talked about. He seems to have been a historical person of the 5th century CE or AD. He came from Britain, from the island of Britain. He was in fact himself not Irish. His first contact with Ireland apparently took place because he was kidnapped by Irish pirates and sold into slavery in Ireland. But he somehow, of course he says miraculously, he somehow got out from Ireland, got himself an education in his early adulthood, and became a cleric, became a priest, and we think of him as a bishop, but whether he was ever actually installed as a bishop within the Western Church is a good question. But he certainly enjoys that traditional reputation of having been a bishop. He returns to Ireland and he brings Christianity with him. He seems primarily to have worked in the northern part of Ireland, in the northern half of Ireland, but it's also possible that he made forays down into the south, into the provinces of Leinster or Munster. Anyway, he probably came to an Ireland in the 5th century, which was already to some extent Christian. Evidence is that there probably were already pockets of Christians, especially in the south of Ireland. And Ireland enjoys the reputation of being the first country in Western Christendom, or the first area in Western Europe, to accept Christianity, not on the basis of being a part of the Roman Empire, and it in some ways is a religion that seems to have spread and become quite popular in Ireland among various segments of the population in the 5th and 6th centuries. Though it's always the case with any instance where a new religion enters an area, that there are aspects of the earlier religious tradition, the earlier religious system of belief, of practice, of ritual that persist into the new religious phase. And certainly that's true about Christianity as it developed in Ireland. Now, what do we know about St. Patrick? Well, there are some Latin works that have survived from the 5th century that are ascribed to Patrick, and most scholars are inclined to accept that attribution and to see these as in fact works composed by St. Patrick. Perhaps the most notable one is a text which is known as the Confessio in Latin, which translates into English as the Confession, which makes it sound very exciting and maybe even revealing a side of St. Patrick that we might not expect. But this is confession, or confessio in Latin, in the sense of really profession, as in a profession of faith. Though he does, in fact, in this semi-autobiographical text, talk about his own experiences and talk about some bitter memories he has about an encounter with someone to whom he did confess, in the sense that we understand confession, and who then used that evidence of Patrick's human frailty against him. But Patrick, in his writings, and also Patrick in the extensive body of legends that developed about him in Ireland, and even beyond Ireland, after his time, which would be roughly the 5th century CE, Patrick very much becomes almost a microcosm of the macrocosm of Irish Christianity and of the attitudes that inform the remarkable development of an Irish literary tradition. The Irish probably were the ones who invented the idea in Western Europe after the fall of Rome and after the decline of classical civilization. The Irish came up with the brilliant idea of why not use the Latin alphabet, which they had acquired courtesy of Christianity. Why not use the Latin alphabet to come up with a system of writing out the native language, namely the language we know as Irish, sometimes referred to as Gaelic. This is a language very different from Latin. It's a language very different from English. It's a language very different from the other languages of Western Europe, except to some extent from Welsh. Welsh and other British Celtic languages are part of the same family as Irish. It's the Celtic family of languages. Scottish Gaelic, a language still spoken today, is actually an offshoot of Irish Gaelic. So there is kinship there as well. But in any case, Irish is a language that has this remarkable opportunity to be preserved in a written form in the second half of the first millennium CE, courtesy of this ingenious Irish idea to come up with a written form of it. The idea catches on with other peoples and other languages as well. And one could argue that the history of medieval literature in the West, of literature that we are, of course, familiar with, probably more than we are with Celtic literary traditions. So works such as the Old English Beowulf poem, or later works such as the medieval romances coming from the French language world, that the whole idea of coming up with written forms of your own spoken language using the Latin alphabet indirectly starts with the Irish, and the influence of that has profound impact on the rest of Europe as well. So Patrick represents the Irish in many different ways. Notice that we do have texts attributed to Patrick, which come to us seemingly from Patrick himself. These are in Latin, so Patrick is not engaged in the activity of trying to turn Irish into a written language as well. But in many respects, Patrick is still reflective of this fascination that the Irish developed in the Middle Ages with writing and with the possibilities for turning the language you speak into a written language. What are you going to preserve? Well, the people responsible for this are in fact Christians. Again, the whole notion of literacy is something that's introduced to the Irish, primarily by way of Christianity, though even before Christianity, the Irish were certainly aware of the fact that there was a Roman presence over in Britain, across the Irish Sea, and Britain was in fact a part of the Roman Empire, and there was literacy in Latin there. But Christianity is what really brings the idea of a written language and of the importance of a written language home to the Irish, and they start applying it to their own literary tradition. So in some ways, Patrick, while he's writing in Latin, The stories about him suggest that he too was very much interested in native tradition, though approaching it with a great deal of caution, because much of the native Irish tradition was not compatible with Christianity as it was understood in this early medieval or late antique period of the 5th and 6th centuries. But in his confession, in his confessio, Patrick is already giving us some intriguing hints about Irish tradition and about what the Irish believed in and how they went about their religious beliefs and also their customs in general before Christianity actually took root among the people that Patrick was working with. So Patrick himself represents this fascinating issue of writing and of the importance of writing and of what are you going to write? Are you going to write about your own native traditions? Now, fortunately, the Irish did decide to do that. This literary tradition that develops in the monasteries and churches is focused not just on religious topics, Christian religious topics, but also is engaging in a kind of ethnography, in coming up with an account, as it were, of the pre-Christian tradition insofar as it was still known in the second half of the first millennium CE to these churchmen and perhaps even some church women. So in addition to works in Latin, which also were produced in profusion in early medieval Ireland, we have works in Irish. Many of them are based on Christian religious themes. Some of them are actually lives of saints, which starts out as a genre in Latin, but then switches over into Irish in the course of roughly several hundred years, so that by the time we get into the second millennium, lives of saints are being written in Ireland in Irish. But there are also texts which seem to preserve stories that go back to the pre-Christian tradition. And in many cases, I think, these are stories which are being seen, if I may use a biblical image, these are stories that are being seen through a glass darkly. Because by the time some of these seemingly ancient stories were written down and preserved for us in written form, that is in the latter centuries of the first millennium CE into the early centuries of the second millennium CE, Christianity had been basically the default in Ireland for a while. And to what extent did these clerics who composed this literature, to what extent were they still in fact in touch with the earlier traditions? To what extent did those earlier traditions actually survive into their period? So I think there is a lot of imagination, a lot of reconstruction, a lot of, gee, maybe this is what our ancestors were like, and this is what the stories were that they told about themselves, that informs this early Irish literature that, if perhaps we want to be too accepting, we could think of as being a kind of almost archaeological remnant of pre-Christian times. And I think these stories about Irish heroes and heroines, stories about figures like Cuchulainn, or the tragic story of Deirdre, that we think of these as relics of a pre-Christian past, but in any case, they certainly were reformed and they were reworked in the period of Christianity. Another way in which Patrick, in addition to this issue of literacy and of writing and of what you preserve in writing, that the figure of Patrick brings up, is the issue of vision. And in his confession, in this semi-autobiographical work, which Patrick seemingly composed, he does talk about his own visions. And visions are a very important theme in medieval Irish literature, whether they are overtly Christian texts or texts which in some cases purport to give a picture of pre-Christian Ireland. To use an expression used by a former US president, the vision thing is very much a part of the medieval Irish literary tradition. And there is even the notion that the literature itself is in some cases inspired by visionary experiences of the authors or of those who are conveying these stories or conveying these images to posterity. So Patrick himself is visionary, and that theme of the vision and of the importance of the vision, and also of what you do with the vision, and how seriously do you take the vision. The vision is oftentimes prophetic. The vision is telling you about better times ahead or bad times ahead. And this also relates to the whole fascinating notion of poetry in Irish tradition. One of the words for poet in Irish is fila, and the fila literally means someone who sees. So the poet is in effect a seer. And there is a very strong visual element to poetry as composed in medieval Ireland, and possibly this does go back to pre-Christian times. The idea of the poet as someone who sees and who takes what he or she sees and turns it into something verbal. And then, of course, with the introduction of literacy and with the invention of a written form of Irish, that poetic pronouncement now finds yet another medium, which is the written word. And so writing and poetry develop a very close connection. And again, we can see some of this with the figure of Patrick. A third aspect in which Patrick represents a microcosm of the glorious macrocosm of medieval Irish literary culture is something we've already mentioned, that fascination and yet also caution about the past and about recording the past, and of using literature as a way to create a kind of time capsule of either the genuine past or a reimagined past. As I said, in Patrick's own writings, we see some of that fascination expressed, but certainly in the later literary tradition that develops, there is a great deal of focus on the past and on what the past was like. And this leads to a certain incompatibility, because again, as we said, the people in charge of writing in early medieval Ireland were Christians. And this really goes for the whole extent of the Irish literary tradition, which extends all the way down to modern times, that there is very much of a Christian element throughout, which is not necessarily compatible with this pre-Christian or imagined pre-Christian element, which also plays a role. You have a literary tradition, but you also perhaps have an oral tradition of storytelling, which is the source for maybe some of this notion of the past and of characters from the past and legendary or even mythological figures from the past. And how to put these things together and how to develop an attitude about the past that allows you to record it without necessarily saying, kids, try this at home, or giving it a seal of approval. I think of what you sometimes find on TV stations, especially late at night, when there's some public service or political programming. and the television station issues a warning beforehand that the station is not to be held responsible for the views that are about to be expressed. And there is that attitude to be found in the Irish literary tradition as well. There's a wonderful text that comes to us from, it's the longest text we have in medieval Irish literature. The translation of the title into English would be something like the conversation of the old ones, or the conversation of the ancients. And the ancients in question are St. Patrick and ancient heroes who, like Rip Van Winkle from American tradition, somehow miraculously, and whether the miraculous power is coming from the Christian God or is coming from some pre-Christian source is not clear, but Patrick and these ancient heroes somehow actually do meet back in the time when Patrick was alive and Patrick was traveling through Ireland. And these ancient heroes proceed to tell Patrick stories about their adventures and about the good old days. And Patrick, now again, this is not the historical Patrick. This is a Patrick that has developed into this legendary, larger-than-life figure by the time we come to the 12th and 13th centuries CE. But this Patrick is definitely sympathetic, and he wants to hear these stories. But he is also concerned about the content and about the fact that the stories told are not necessarily compatible with Christian ethics or with the Christian way of viewing the world. So he will sometimes issue a caution to both these ancient heroes telling the stories, who, however, do accept Christianity and do become baptized and are to some extent aware of the incompatibility themselves. But it's as if Patrick were driven by the thought that, well, it's important to preserve these traditions that these ancient heroes are sharing with us in writing. And so long as they are written down, they have some kind of a Christian seal of approval. So this text, this dialogue of the ancients, or this conversation of the ancients, is chock full of stories that might be representing a pre-Christian Irish past, but also might be a imagined past. And whether it's the real thing or a creation which is meant to sound authentic, it's fascinating stuff, and it makes for fascinating reading. So I would recommend it. Now, one thing we associate with Irish tradition, or a couple of things actually that we associate with Irish tradition. One is the color green, and of course, especially on St. Patrick's Day as it comes to be celebrated. Green is a very emblematic color of Ireland itself, and is waved about. Of course, it's part of the modern Irish flag. But green is in fact the color of a lot of Ireland during a lot of the year, due to the amount of precipitation that Ireland receives. It is indeed very much an emerald isle, as it is sometimes referred to, on account of the greenness of so much of Ireland. But green also has connotations of the supernatural. This is an Irish folk tradition, and it perhaps also is a color that, if in its association with Ireland, imbues Ireland itself with that supernatural aura, which I think we moderns today are more happy to entertain than perhaps the stricter authors of earlier times, who might be worried about some of this storytelling or some of these traditions getting in the way of proper Christian belief or proper Christian behavior. So for us, the fact that green might have some kind of even pre-Christian supernatural connotation is something that makes Ireland and the association of green with Ireland all the more attractive. So there is that. There is the importance of the color green. Something else that I think might come to mind if we were asked to mention Irish traditions that are familiar to us are leprechauns. There's been a good deal of controversy about the figure of the leprechaun. Let's see. It might mean something like little body, which would make sense given the popular Irish or non-Irish notion of the leprechaun, which we have in modern culture today. They are conceived to be diminutive. They seem to be diminutive in some of the earliest references we have to the leprechaun in early Irish literature. In fact, a curious thing about the leprechaun in that earliest reference to them that we have is that they seem to be associated with water, that they seem to be aquatic creatures or at least amphibian creatures. But the most popular story told about the leprechaun in Irish tradition, as recorded in more recent centuries, sees the leprechaun as someone who knows where treasure is hidden. He's a supernatural creature, and if someone catches a leprechaun, you have to keep your eye on the leprechaun because otherwise it will escape. The leprechaun is very eager to escape, of course, and does not want to be held in captivity. And the reason why you might want to catch a leprechaun is in the hope that the leprechaun will reveal to you where a hidden treasure is found. But oftentimes all the leprechaun will do is laugh or chuckle if the human captor is in fact close to a treasure or could have won a treasure but somehow has bungled it. So in fact, in these stories about capturing leprechauns, you never do find that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, as it were. You never are in fact satisfied by whatever the leprechaun does, and in some ways the leprechaun is really mocking you, both for your greed, but also for the fact that you are, after all, subject to the human condition, and in the human condition most of us don't become wealthy. Now, the leprechaun is just one of various creatures that still in Irish folk tradition, as recorded even in the last century and probably could still be recorded in this century in some parts of Ireland, that there are supernatural beings out there, and the supernatural beings inhabit the landscape, and there are parts of the landscape that are more supernatural than others. Ireland, as those of you who have been to Ireland might have noticed, is full of hills and is full of mounds, and many of those hills and many of those mounds are in fact artificially made. They are human constructs, and oftentimes the supernatural is associated with those mounds or with abandoned structures, and also with particular plants or bushes or trees that are to be found in the landscape. The supernatural very much is a part of the landscape, and the supernatural folk who can be encountered, especially at times that are in between times. So times that are in between the seasons, or times such as what we call Halloween, when there is a shift from one portion of the year to another. That's oftentimes when these supernatural dwellings, oftentimes to be found in mounds, open up, and there's the possibility of encountering the supernatural. But it's very dangerous, and time works differently in the supernatural world from how it works in our world. And there's always the danger of being trapped in the other world and of coming out and realizing that you've been in there for what seemed like not so long a period of time, but in fact you have been in there for many years, and all the people you knew and loved are now in fact gone. So you have to be careful, and probably best to avoid the beings of the other world, such as the leprechaun. and such as other people. In English, as spoken in Ireland, they are oftentimes referred to as the fairies. But these are not fairies in the Victorian sense of charming creatures with delicate wings. Supernatural beings can be quite rough in their encounters with human beings. So again, caution is to be advised. And this tradition about supernatural beings, this is the sort of thing that we think might in fact go back to pre-Christian times, and then in some ways even became kind of compatible with Christianity as it developed in Ireland in the Middle Ages. And in fact, you could still find some people in rural parts of Ireland who would claim that the supernatural folk, the people who live in those mounds or in those parts of the landscape around which we should be careful and respectful, that they are in fact the angels who rebelled against God, according to the book of Revelation in the Bible, and who were cast out from heaven. But they didn't make it all the way down to hell. They did not become the devils of Christian tradition. Rather, they landed, as it were, in Ireland, and they took refuge in Ireland. And there is something problematic about them, but not as problematic as there would be if they had actually ended up in hell and became part of Satan and his crew. So notice there's an attempt to somehow bring this notion of supernatural beings to be found in the Irish landscape together with the Christian, or with one Christian view of the cosmos and of the different types of beings that inhabit the different levels of the world, including angels in heaven, including devils in hell, and including these in-between supernatural beings who are to be found in Ireland, for example.